Good morning. You're watching Businessworld Live. I'm Danny Laurel. It's the start of a new trading day. Let's kick off with our top story. The International Monetary Fund has slashed its growth outlook for the Philippines to 5.4%. That's from an initial projection of 6.9%. The multilateral lender attributed the downward revision to the reimposition of tighter restrictions in Metro Manila and nearby provinces in late March until mid-May. The updated projection is below the government's revised growth target of 6 to 7%. The IMF said the economy is now recovering gradually as measures are eased. However, it flagged downside risks to growth outlook, which include the possible resurgence of infections and delays in the vaccine rollout due to supply constraints. For 2022, the IMF raised its GDP forecast to 7% from 6.5%. The lender says the core of the forecast for next year is the improvement of health situations, which will allow for more businesses to reopen and for more investments to come in. The Finance Department says the government can only provide 173 billion pesos in stimulus funds this year. Finance Chief Sonny Dominguez said it will be unsustainable if the fiscal deficit exceeds the cap of 9.3% of GDP. Dominguez said they are internally looking for sources to finance the 173 billion peso allocation, which he says should be aimed at combating poverty and hunger after the pandemic dealt a heavy blow on the poor families. Meanwhile, the finance secretary said they will remain open to Bayanihan 3 if lawmakers can identify other potential revenue-generating measures. Still, he said the DOF is not proposing any tax hikes to boost revenues, but instead is looking for savings from the 2020 budget and asked state-run firms to increase their dividend remittances this year. Very quick check on the index open here. You can see us up by 1.21 points. That's up by 0.02% to 6974.56. This follows how we closed as well yesterday. Slightly down, but again, just trading sideways here, just a few points lower. Mainly, it was a flat performance, and this according to China Bank Securities' Zoran Philip Musni. He said investors were generally bullish yesterday due to strong remittances data that we saw in the month of April and also some developments in the vaccination program. And he expects that there might be another attempt to break through the 7,000 resistance level. It has proven to be quite a strong resistance there, but ultimately might still end up lower than 7,000. You can see on my terminal here a bit of a pullback already as investors start taking profit. Let's see which ones are opening in the green here this morning. Let me just refresh my terminal here so we can see the real-time data. JG Summit up by 1.8%, followed by Emperador and PLDT. And on the downside, you've got Bloomberry dragging down the index together with SM Prime and BDO. So just a very mixed bag here with investors sort of wary on where to put their money at the moment. Now, one stock to be watching out for today, however, is Dito Telecom. That's as they have just announced that the subscribers have already hit 1 million subscribers. That's in a span of 3 months. According to them, that is a feat that they are certainly proud of. Now, remember that they made their commercial debut in March 8th. That was first in Visayas and Mindanao. And then on May 17th, it had launched in Metro Manila. Dito Telecom up by close to 1% this morning in the first 4 minutes of trade at 9 pesos and 74 centavos. Here are other headlines we're keeping our eyes on. The NGCP said it will hold a competitive public bidding for the supply of power reserves or ancillary services to fulfill the government requirements and secure the best value for consumers. NGCP President and CEO Anthony Almeida said an open and public bidding will ensure full transparency and accountability, which all stakeholders deserve. However, the NGCP reiterated that procuring reserves on either firm and non-firm arrangements will not solve the recurring brownouts or power interruptions. The NGCP insists that improving the distribution side of things will not do much since our problem is with power is at the core a supply issue. The tourism industry's contribution to the economy has plunged to its lowest level in at least 2 decades in 2020. Data compiled by the Philippine Statistics Authority showed tourism's direct gross value added accounted for 5.4% of GDP in 2020, down from 12.8% in 2019. This was the lowest level in at least 20 years based on available data dating back to 2000. The decline in 2020 snapped the sector's 11 straight years of growth, 10 of which were in double digits. Now, here to chat with us about what the silver linings could be in this hardest hit sector, we have with us Yusek Benito Bengzon of the Department of Tourism. Good morning, Yusek, and welcome to Business World Live.
Good morning, Danny, and thank you for having me in your program.
Yusek, kindly react to these figures: 5.4% growth in 2020 versus 12.8%, lowest in 2 decades. But considering the situation, is this figure not that bad? I mean, could we have possibly done any better? And is there something to be learned from in 2020 moving forward?
Well, maybe just to provide a bit of perspective, no? The pandemic obviously has affected the global tourism industry. And in the report of the UNWTO, World Tourism Organization, it estimated that global arrivals went down by about 80%. And in terms of revenue, the industry also suffered the same amount. So when you talk about the decrease in revenue, decrease in headcount, that's to be expected because many of the borders were closed. Many governments imposed travel restrictions, which resulted in a sharp decline in the movement of tourists around the world. So in the case of the Philippines, in the latest report of the Philippine Statistics Authority, yes, the contribution of GDP has gone down from 12.8% in 2019 to about 5.4% last year. And this represents a drop of about 61%. So when you look at the percentage drop, it more or less is at the same pace, no, that global tourism has been affected.
Okay, so basically something to be expected here. Sir, what is the status right now? Can you compare those that were temporarily closed just because of following the lockdown protocols, and those who have permanently closed and would be affecting the sector moving forward? What's the realistic target in terms of contribution to GDP for this year?
It's very difficult to come up with projections. No? We've often been asked as to when we will go back to pre-pandemic levels. Even the UNWTO has had a difficult time coming up with projections. The focus at the moment is really to help business enterprises and displaced workers. So in the instruction of Tourism Secretary Bernard Romulo Puyat early on was to craft a tourism response and recovery plan, or TRRP, which would be our blueprint for recovery. And this particular blueprint focuses on two things: helping business enterprises survive, and making sure that the displaced workers are somehow given some kind of financial assistance.
Okay, so let's talk about the supply side issue here, and making sure that they stay on their feet. Bayanihan to us had stimulus for the tourism sector, but in fact, we had someone from the DTI on our show saying that not a lot of them are availing of the zero interest loans, even if they could. So there's quite some liquidity available naman, but they're not tapping into them. What is the catalyst that needs to happen here? Is it demand side driven? Is it lockdown driven? They have the money, and how can you get them on their feet if they're not availing of these loans?
So that's correct. Under Bayanihan too, about 6 billion pesos was allocated for working capital loans to be administered by the Small Business Corporation of the Department of Trade and Industry. And the latest report that we obtained from SB Corp is that utilization is still at around 5% of the total amount. We conducted a series of focus group discussions in the first half of May. And one thing that came out of those consultations was that many enterprises were and are still hesitant to take out the loans because of the uncertainty of demand. When you talk about uncertainty of demand, you're basically talking about when we will allow foreign tourists to enter our borders, and also when we will allow more destinations to reopen. So essentially, the concern is the demand side. When will the tourists start coming back? I think at the levels no, that we saw prior to the pandemic. But what we're seeing now is that there's a gradual increase in the uptake of the loans, and as more destinations ease the restrictions, then we're hoping that enterprises will avail of the working capital loans that have terms and conditions that you will not find anywhere else.
Sir, can you say that there's enough stimulus? It's just that they're not tapping into it.
The the loans that are being granted now under the Cares for Travel program of SB Corp are probably the most attractive that you will find out there. Zero interest, zero collateral. There's just a small a service fee that has to be paid, and even the grace period has been extended from 1 year to 2 years. So and the key here is to make sure that we slowly but safely open up our destinations. Make sure that the enterprises and all subsectors in tourism comply with the health and safety protocols that the DOT has crafted, and also to make sure that the consumers, the general public, continue to follow the minimum public health standards. The success of our restart efforts will really depend on how we help contain the situation in the different destinations that have reopened.
Okay, so stimulus not the issue here. It's really the safe reopening of these tourism and also the demand side. Let's talk about the demand side, sir. What is causing the hesitancy from the consumer side? Is this, they're not having a consumer spending power, or is there actually this power that they have, but there's not enough tourism destinations, or there's, the RT-PCR thing costs that are still making them hesitant? And how are you addressing these bottlenecks from the consumer end?
Well, let me break it down into two categories of consumers. First, the foreign travelers. So clearly, because of the travel, the entry restrictions, many foreigners, even if they want to come to the Philippines, are not able to do so. But based on our consultations with our travel trade partners, the operators, the airlines, the agents, there is still a strong demand for these foreigners to come to the Philippines. With respect to Filipino travelers, the local market, we've had a couple of surveys conducted last year. And the good thing that came out of it is that the appetite for travel is still very strong. 70, 80, 85% of Filipinos are still willing to travel even during the pandemic. And a very high percentage, about 90, 95%, said that they're willing to comply with the minimum health protocols. So the demand is there, the appetite is there. I think when you
So
talk
can you
about
clarify, this is domestic travel? They're willing to travel domestically or abroad?
well, we're talking about domestically.
Domestic travel. Okay.
We're talking about domestic travel. So the demand is still there. The preference, as to be expected, has changed slightly. The consumers will be opting for more open air, well ventilated kinds of tourism activities. So we will see stronger demand for, of course, the beaches, the mountains, and even a special interest like motorbikes and bicycles. And in terms of traveling, many of them will be moving around with their families. Of course, they've been together, locked up in their households for the last several months. So it provides some kind of assurance that they know the medical condition of one another. But overall, the demand is still there. In the case of the DOT, we're trying to encourage movement by making it easier for them to move around. And one example that I can mention here is that the DOT, through the Tourism Promotions Board, continues to provide subsidy for qualified domestic tourists for their RT-PCR testing.
Okay. Sir, do you have any sort of studies in your department which can assure consumers that traveling is already safe at this point in time? Are you able to illustrate that, with the specific protocols, the spread of COVID has not been due to tourism?
Well, we have not conducted a formal study in this regard, but based on initial reports that we have obtained from our regional offices, none of the cases can be directly attributed to tourism. Remember, in the opening up of our destinations, many LGUs, at least initially, required negative RT-PCR test result. And even to this day, many destinations continue to require that. So that's one way of ensuring that only those who are clear are allowed to travel to the destinations that have reopened. On the supply side, we're very strict in monitoring the operations of the DOT accredited establishments. These establishments have to make sure that they comply with the health and safety protocols that we have developed.
Sir, vaccination and quarantine, how likely is this to happen that any fully vaccinated tourist does not have to quarantine in the Philippines? Which countries, for example, are you looking at, to pattern what the IATF and what you're, recommending in terms of tourism for foreign arrivals here in the Philippines? And is there a level of inoculation or percentage of the population that needs to happen before this can take place?
There was a small working group that was created by the IATF to study the protocols for incoming passengers who have been inoculated. And the small working group came up with its proposal broken down into three phases. The first phase basically involves providing a green lane, so-called green lane, for those who have been inoculated here in the Philippines. So for those who have been vaccinated here and those documents have been authenticated, when they return to the Philippines, instead of doing the 10-day quarantine period, they will only do 7 days. The second phase of the proposal will now involve authenticating and recognizing certificates for vaccinations that were made abroad. So for example, if you're a Filipino or PhilAm or an OFW inoculated either in the US or in the Middle East, we will try to find or to develop a system that will authenticate and recognize such certificates so that in the future they may also be allowed some kind of a reduced quarantine. But again, I have to mention that this is still being evaluated. What has been approved by the IATF is what I mentioned under phase one. There's a third phase that was presented to the IATF, and this is still for discussion, but this basically involves what we refer to as travel bubbles, meaning containing the movement of foreigners coming from a country where the COVID-19 has been contained and where they have a high inoculation rate, and then bringing them to a destination where health and safety protocols can be assured and where there is also a high level of vaccination among the locals.
Sir, final question. Even before the pandemic, we were lagging behind our ASEAN neighbors in terms of tourism, and this was something that we were actively trying to promote. Of course, how do we become competitive now? You mentioned travel bubbles. Are there some sort of bilateral agreements that will allow for us to benefit when the rest of global tourism gets underway?
Well, I will not quite agree with the word lagging, no, because if you look at the figures, if you look at the growth rate of inbound arrivals to the Philippines over the 5-year period prior to the pandemic, 2014 to 2019, our growth rate was about 8%. This is higher than the Asian average of about 5-6%, and higher than the global average of about 3 to 4%. So in terms of average growth rate, we did better than most of our neighbors. But moving forward, what's really important is how to accelerate the recovery of tourism. And what is going to be key here would be how well we're able to tap into the local market, the domestic market. Many do not know that the Philippines is one of the largest domestic tourism markets in the region. In 2019, we had 110 million domestic trips that resulted in a revenue of over 3 trillion pesos. And we strongly feel that in the next several months, it will really be domestic tourists that will help keep many of our enterprises afloat. So as we slowly but surely reopen our destinations, it's very important that we encourage our kababayans to responsibly travel and support tourism, especially at the community level.
Okay, so dito muna tayo sa Pilipinas pag nag-reopen na po ang travel. Thank you so much for those insights. Of course, that was Yusek Benito Bengzon of the Department of Tourism.
Thank you very much, Danny.
That's a first look into the business day. Today is Thursday, June 17, 2021. Catch Business World Live for the market close at 3:15 p.m. Today, I'm Danny Laurel. Mask on, wash hands, stay safe, Philippines. We are One News.